Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and this is my free tutorial for the amazing Canon R7 mirrorless camera. If you have a different camera, or if you want to check out our tutorial for the iPhone, visit this link, sdp.io/tutorial. There's a lot to learn, so this is a long video. Follow along with your hands. Get the camera and work with me. That way you will remember it better. Bookmark it so you can come back to it later, and use the table of contents in the description so you can skip around to different parts that you're interested in. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We have tutorials and reviews coming up. The manual for this camera is 1,000 pages long. I've read it, so you don't have to. But what you should do is grab your phone and download it and save the PDF to your phone so that when you're out in the field and you need to remember where some setting is, you can quickly search that PDF. Grab the PDF of the manual from this link. Canon will regularly release firmware updates for the R7 that fix bugs and improve functionality. The camera will not tell you about this. It is not like your phone. To get those updates, you'll have to just check Canon's website, or what I do is follow canonrumors.com and they'll tell me whenever there is a new update. DSLR users, there's a lot to learn about this new mirrorless camera. You have to change the way you shoot. The most important thing you can learn is that you can actually switch to live view, the rear screen here, and actually interact with the screen. In the DSLR world, that didn't work that well. All your focusing systems changed, but here in the mirrorless world, everything stays the same, whether you're using the viewfinder or the rear screen. Being able to flip it forward is incredibly useful. Of course, you can get in front of the camera and film yourself like I am now, but even if you're like a portrait photographer, this means that you can set your camera up on a tripod, frame the portrait subject, and then get in front of the camera to adjust lights, use a remote trigger to fire the camera. You can be fixing the model's hair, or even like hold something out of the way and snap a picture remotely. Being able to see what's happening while you're in front of the camera is incredibly useful. One drawback of mirrorless is that it's using batteries all the time. This is an electronic viewfinder, which means it's consuming electricity when you look through it. That's not the case in the DSLR world. Therefore, you should be turning it off and on every time you pick it up. Fortunately, Canon put the on-off switch right here next to your thumb, so you no longer have to use your other hand to turn it on and off. You don't have to worry about the battery charger anymore. On the side here, you will see the USB port. Charge through that just like you do your smartphone. Plug it in every night. It's USB-C, so it should work with just about any USB-C charger, but it does require a certain amount of amperage. So test it out before you go travel. But you no longer have to travel with your battery charger, so your bag's going to be a little bit lighter. Also, DSLR users, you're probably used to using the thumbstick and like scrolling it around and picking one of your focusing points. You no longer have to do that. Now you're going to let the camera pick the autofocusing point most of the time. And other times you'll use a tracking mode. Well, you'll basically use focus recompose, but you can compose out to the corners of the frame because autofocus works great all over the frame. It opens up so many new possibilities. Let's talk about the actual hardware of the camera now. The first thing I want to point out is the diopter that is right here next to the viewfinder. This dials in a glasses prescription. Hold it up to your eye and then turn that diopter up and down until the letters and numbers at the bottom of the screen look sharp. Don't look through the lens, look at the actual graphics in the display. This can get hit accidentally in your bag. So if suddenly you find that your camera is not autofocusing on anything, it might just be the diopter. And if you adjust it for yourself and then hand it to somebody else, they might have a slightly different prescription than you, so they might think it's all blurry and need to adjust that. You got a free strap with your camera, but to me, it's kind of ugly and it says Canon all over, and I'm not the type who wants to advertise some particular brand. My favorite strap are Lucky straps. I love them because they snap on and off really quickly. If you want to check out Lucky straps, head to this link here. Let's talk about the memory cards. Under this door here, next to the battery, pop it open and you'll see slots for 2 memory cards. Those are UHS-II SD cards. UHS-II is a little bit faster than standard SD cards. You can put standard older SD cards in there, but they'll be slower, but they'll work just fine. You can tell a UHS-II card because it has 2 rows of contacts at the back. Because this is such a fast camera with big 30 megapixel files, I strongly recommend getting 2 UHS-II cards. There's a reason that you'll want 2. The camera can write simultaneously to both cards. That way, if and when an SD card fails, you will have a second backup copy. You might never have had an SD card fail, but I did the world's biggest poll of photographers, over 4,000 people, and I found the more shots you took, the more likely you were to have had an SD card fail. I've been a professional photographer for 25 years. I probably had 6 or 7 memory cards fail. So it doesn't happen all the time, but when it does happen, it can be absolutely crushing. Like what if it's your kid's first steps or a wedding or something? Of course, you should just take that simple step and put 2 SD cards in. Here are recommended links that you can use to get 2 of them. I recommend getting big SD cards, 128 gigs at the minimum, but preferably more like 256 gigs or even more. The reason is you don't want to have to be formatting your memory card all the time. You want to be able to leave your pictures on the card for a few weeks, for an entire trip, or maybe even a couple of months, because it acts as an extra backup. Like, what if you copy the files to your computer and then your computer fails and then you don't have any pictures? I also recommend getting some extra cards and stashing them throughout your life. Get really, really cheap, like $8 SD cards, and put one in your glove box, and your purse, and your office desk, your suitcase. You know why? Because at some point, you're going to take the memory cards out and put them into your computer and forget them, not put them back into your camera. And if you don't believe me, read this testimonial from somebody who took that advice from an earlier tutorial, and it actually did save their butt. Once you put a memory card in there, you'll want to format it. That erases all of your pictures, so be sure you're ready to do that, but it also allows you to reuse the memory card. Now I want to show you the menu system on this camera, so I'm going to hook up an HDMI field recorder. On the back of the camera, I'm going to push the menu button in the upper left corner, and now I'm going to go over to the wrench icon here, go down to Format Card on page 1, select this, and then I'll select the memory card, scroll to OK, it's going to warn me, and now my memory card is blank and completely ready to use. Here's a camera setting everybody should change right away, and that is release shutter without card. With this setting enabled, you can take pictures without having a memory card in your camera, and this screws people over because you'll grab your camera, you'll go to take some pictures, and then you realize it was not recording the whole time. So let's go in and turn this off just right away. Going back into the menu, this time I'm going to the camera tab, page 7. And you can see release shutter without card is on by default. So I'll select that and I will choose off. I'm doing all of this using the joystick on the back of the camera because I have to record it, but you should be touching the screen. You can even drag your finger left and right to quickly make selections. Makes things much easier. Let's talk about the ports on the side of the camera. The top port here is for the microphone. If you use an external microphone, for example, if you're vlogging like this, you should definitely connect something into it rather than using the on-camera mic. The on-camera mic is not good quality, and audio quality matters even more than video quality to people. Down below it, you'll find a panel for the remote shutter trigger. I will recommend a wireless Bluetooth shutter trigger that I like much more than the wired one, so you can probably cover that up and never open it again. At the bottom, you have a headphone jack clearly labeled. If you are recording video and you want to make sure you don't record any wind, then that's a good thing to hook into. On the right side, you see ports for the micro HDMI, if for some reason you want to hook up a field monitor like I am, but you'll probably never need that. And then USB, which is useful for either transferring pictures if you don't have a memory card reader, or for charging the camera if you have a USB-C charger with enough amperage. I don't know about you, but I'm human. I tend to make mistakes, and when there's a really important picture that I want to take, I tend to get a little bit distracted and forget things, and that has made me screw up so many pictures that I made a little checklist for myself, something to read to calm myself down to make sure I'm not forgetting anything important. And I print it out and I stick it right here. You actually have room for a couple of little checklists if you want to use it. If you want to check out my checklist, you can just download it and print it yourself. It's completely free. Visit this link here, stick it back there, and then you read through it. And that will help you get the perfect shot without making a mistake, because human error really is a thing. Underneath your lens here, you can see the camera's sensor. This sensor will tend to collect dust. You should clean it if and only if you start to see annoying dust. But if you do get some dust on your sensor, order a sensor cleaning kit from this link here. You need like a wet swab aps-c sensor cleaning kit. And if you use the sdp.io/clean link, you can see me demonstrating exactly how to use it. I have done this dozens of times on my cameras. I find it to be quite safe if you do it properly. I always get dust on my sensors when I travel, because that's when you're out and about, maybe in dusty areas, probably changing lenses on a regular basis to get the shot. Thus, I always travel with one of these in my bag. So you might want to practice before you travel, and then make sure you pack one in your camera bag so that you are prepared when you're out and about. Now I want to talk about the buttons on the camera. You're probably familiar with the shutter button, which is right under your index finger here. Half press it, and by default, the camera will focus. Fully press it, and the camera will take pictures. Directly behind that, we have the MFN button. If you push that, it brings up some quick settings. So you can push that and push it again to alternate between each of these different settings. And if these settings don't make sense to you right now, don't worry, I'll explain it in just a little bit. Use the main dial, that's the next dial right next to the shutter button, to actually adjust these settings. So you can see I can quickly adjust the ISO up or down here, or go all the way down to auto ISO, which is what you should probably generally leave it at. Behind that, to the left, we have the record button. It looks just like a record button. Push it and you start recording video. Push it again to stop. You don't necessarily have to be in video mode on the camera, though it's smart to switch to video mode. The next button over is ISO. Now I just showed you how to change ISO, but this is just a quicker way to do it. Push it once and then you can use the main dial to quickly adjust the ISO. Over to the left, we have the mode dial. This switches between your fully automatic modes and things like FV, P, TV, AV, M, B, all these custom modes. Don't worry, I'm going to explain what each of those means. I just wanted to show you where the actual dial itself was. One over from that is the lock button. When you push that, the controls lock and cannot be accidentally adjusted. I never used the lock button, and in fact, it's only ever been pressed accidentally and frustrated me when I went to try to change settings. But maybe you're quickly handing your camera off to a tourist to take a picture of you and you don't want them screwing things up. You could lock it so they can't mess it up for you. Of course, the next thing down is the power button. You can turn it off, on, or switch to video mode. For stills, use on. For video, use the video camera. And whenever you're not shooting with it, you should turn it off to save batteries. If you don't, it'll go into power saving mode, but you'll be surprised how quickly you burn through batteries if you don't turn it on and off. Going to the back of the camera, we have a combination control dial and thumbstick. You can see if I turn the dial in the current settings, I'm adjusting the exposure compensation, making the picture brighter and darker. If I adjust the thumbstick, well, it's not doing anything right now because of my autofocus mode. Depending on your mode, you can select a different autofocus point by using the thumbstick or by touching the rear screen. To the right of that is the AF on button, which always activates autofocus. Now, in its default configuration, this does exactly the same thing as half pressing the shutter, so you would never need to use it, right? But later in this video, I will show you how to use back button focus, which is the technique I use that decouples autofocus from the shutter button and activates it only when you press AF on, and it's such a pro way to do things that I know you're going to love that. To the right of that, you have a button that has an asterisk, that little star on it, and that is a metering lock. And I never use the metering lock. So you should think of this as a customizable button, something you could assign later, and something else I'll show you later. And below that you have a button which by default acts to magnify things. So I can press it and then press info to really zoom in. Again, this is probably not the most useful function in its default configuration, but you can change it to do almost anything, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Below that you have the info button, which changes the amount of garbage that it shows on your screen. So by pressing it, I switch between many different display modes. You can see the simplest display mode here just shows nothingness, which is nice if you want to focus on your composition and not worry about camera settings. Push it again, and I get a screen with nothing but camera settings. You can touch this to quickly make adjustments. Push it again, and I get a screen with mostly viewfinder, but some camera settings. If I push it again, I get even more camera settings. I don't like this, that's too much clutter. And if I push it again, you can see I get a histogram. Below that, we have yet another directional pad here that we can use to navigate things, and a very important button, the Q set button. Push this, and it brings up the Q menu. This allows me to quickly navigate really important settings. So I'm moving around with the directional pad here, but I can quickly change the autofocus mode. I can switch between like single shot and servo mode for tracking moving subjects. I could switch between JPEG and RAW or different JPEG qualities. I could go from single shot to high-speed continuous 15 or 30 frames per second. So you can scroll through and customize all of this, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Below that, we have the play button, which previews photos that you've previously taken, and the trash can button. While you're previewing something, you could press the trash can to delete it. Now there's one more button, and it is the depth of field preview button. It's on the front of the camera next to the AF/MF switch here. If I push that, it will give me a depth of field preview. And when you push it by default, you might not see anything. But what you can do is put your camera into AV mode and then set the aperture all the way to the highest setting, like f/22. And now watch what happens when I push it. Watch the background here. See, the background goes from being blurry to being sharp. Blurry, sharp. The depth of field preview button shuts the aperture and the lens down to what it will be when you actually take pictures, so you can see how sharp or blurry the background is going to be. And of course, on the outside of that is the AF/MF switch, where you can switch between autofocus and manual focus. If you do switch to manual focus, you can focus by turning the ring on the lens itself. There's very little reason to use manual focus, but maybe you're doing macro photography or night photography. It's good to know where that is. You might be wondering, should I use the MFN button or the Q button to do things? Just like always use the Q button. I find it easier and quicker. MFN is like a holdover from old DSLRs. Now let's talk about how to customize that Q button. Go into the menus on the camera tab, page 8. you will see Customize Quick Controls. Select that. Now you can go to Edit Layout. Maybe you never change the metering mode. I don't. You can press Info to rearrange things. Select Edit Layout to show which items should be shown or hidden. Let's say you never change the metering mode, which I don't. I will turn that off. And now I can scroll up and down to different pages and pick a different setting that I want. So all these are hidden by default. I frequently turn on and off raw burst mode, so I'll select that. And now I can press the Info button to rearrange it. And you can see raw burst mode took over the setting that I had just hidden. So if I wanted to move this, I could select it and move it up to the top where I find it more useful. Now I'll press Menu to exit and be sure to save and exit my settings. Now when I hit the Q button, you can see raw burst mode is here. Here's another default setting that I insist everybody change. It's the beeping. You don't need that beeping. That is incredibly annoying to the people around you. You already know it's in focus. It's an R7. It's fantastic at that. So let's turn it off. In the menu, I go to the wrench, page 3. I select beep, and then I set that to disable. Now let's talk about how to set your camera to fully auto, because we're going to be messing with the settings a lot. Now, a lot of people think their camera's broken because they put it in some mode and they set the aperture to something crazy. Anytime you get screwed up, just put the dial back on the green. That is a total lifesaver. If you're handing it to your grandfather and he doesn't know how a camera works, put it in green. A little kid, put it in green. Confuse yourself, put it in green. No shame in letting the camera pick the settings. Some of you are kind of new at this and you're not ready for aperture or shutter priority, but you might be ready to do some custom settings. The R7 has scenes built in, things like night photography and portrait photography. It's that second setting right below fully auto. So you can switch into that and it goes into special scene mode. And now you can use the controller to choose the scene. You can just scroll through and look for the one that looks like what you're doing. There's not much more for me to explain. This is beginner mode. There's no shame in that. If the camera helps you get a great picture, I don't care how you do it. Another group of settings are filters. These provide creative control over like the color and the saturation to get you to get like a film look. It's kind of like the Instagram filters that you might apply, except it's done in camera. To select those, just change the mode dial over to the two filter looking things here. And now you can scroll through and pick the filter that you like. These are fun, these are creative, they might inspire you to go out and take some pictures, but they're nothing you can't do if you take pictures in different modes, just using something like Instagram or Lightroom to adjust the settings in post-processing. Now let's talk about the creative modes. This is where it gets to be advanced. This is where professional photographers like myself do all their camera settings. The traditional creative modes are P, which is Program AE. That's still a fully auto mode, but it gives you a little bit extra control. The next mode up is TV. That stands for time value, which other camera companies call shutter priority. This gives you control over the shutter speed. It is what you will use for sports, wildlife, any kind of action. When you're thinking about how long you want that shutter to be open because you want to freeze motion or blur the background on a moving subject, you should be in shutter priority mode. The next mode is AV, that's aperture value or aperture priority. That gives you control over the iris of the lens, which is just like the pupil of your eye. With low values like f2.8, it is wide open, letting in lots of light, but blurring the background behind your subject. With high values like f22, it's letting in very little light, so it's better in bright light than dark light, but it also gets the background nice and sharp. AV lets you control that while changing the shutter speed automatically. The next mode is M, or manual. Manual mode gives you control over both the shutter speed and the aperture simultaneously. The camera can still control auto exposure using ISO, something we'll describe in a little bit. Now, all of these are very complicated, and I've written an entire book that goes into detail about this. This is Stunning Digital Photography, the world's #1 photography book for the past decade. It's literally an award-winning book. It has 20 hours of video in it, hands-on practices, quizzes, and the ebook is like $10. You can pick it up at Northrup.photo along with our other video training. You might want to check out the Book Lovers or the Everything Bundle so you can get everything you need to master photography right away. And I have an entire chapter on camera settings. Today, I'm just showing you how to configure them on your camera. Actually, understanding the right values to use is much more complicated. I do have some free videos you can use here. For learning aperture, head to sdp.io/f-stop. For learning shutter priority, head to sdp.io/shutter. For understanding ISO, head to sdp.iso. And if you want to go full manual, controlling the shutter speed and the aperture, head to sdp.io/go manual. The R7 has another mode, which is kind of unusual, and that's FV. That's flexible value. And this is what I use all the time. So switch to that mode, FV. Now using the dial on the back of the camera, you can see I can select the shutter speed, the aperture, the exposure compensation, or the ISO, all by turning this. Then I can adjust any of those values by changing the main dial. So here I could set the shutter speed to 1/60th. I could scroll over to the aperture and set that to f/5.6. And then I could go and set the ISO manually. I could adjust only the aperture and leave the other settings at auto, and that would be like using aperture priority. Or I could make them all auto, and it would be like a full auto mode. Or I could just change the shutter speed. You can pick which values you're controlling in FV mode, and thus it completely replaces shutter priority, aperture priority, manual mode, and I think it's much more straightforward to use, especially if you just touch the back of the screen to change the values. That's why I use FV all the time. If you screw up your settings, of course you could set them all back to auto. You can also hold the trash can button on the back of your camera and they will automatically reset all to auto. Now let's talk about bulb mode. That's the B on your mode dial. This is a really outdated term, but back in the olden days, you would actually hook up this literal squeeze bulb that would allow you to keep the shutter open. They still call it bulb mode, but it just lets you keep the shutter open for over 30 seconds. Because if you'll notice, like this is shutter priority. The longest I can go is 30 seconds here. I can't go beyond that. So if you want to do a 10-minute exposure, like maybe you're photographing star trails at night, you would go into B bulb mode. And now if you want to do a 10-minute exposure, what you do is you press the shutter button down and you'll see it starts counting. And now just hold your finger there for 10 minutes and don't shake the camera. Okay, that sounds really boring, right? There's an easier way to do it. Hit the menu button, then go to the camera tab, page 7. On page 7, you'll see bulb timer. Select that and choose enable. Then hit the info button and set it to how long you want the exposure to be. So now I've set it to a 10-minute exposure. I'll hit OK. And so now when I go back in and I press the shutter, it's going to start counting for 10 full minutes. That's a very long exposure. Probably never do a 10-minute shutter, but now you know how to. I'm going to push the shutter button again and get out of that and then put myself back into full auto mode. When you do put your camera into weird mode, when you're done, shift it back to full auto mode. That way, the next time you or somebody else picks up your camera, it's not trying to take a 10-minute exposure. I've screwed that up a few times, so that's why I know to tell you to do it. If you want to trigger your camera remotely, check out Canon's BRE1 remote control at this link. It's a Bluetooth remote and it's great for bulbs, for long exposures, for triggering your camera without shaking it, which is good for getting sharper shots, and everybody should have one of these on their bag. Now let's talk about the custom modes on the mode dial. As you scroll over here, you'll see C1, C2, C3. These are so incredibly useful, but I feel like nobody ever uses them. Here's how they work. You set the camera up in the way you like for a particular type of photography. Let's say you're doing sports photography. For sports, I would go into shutter priority, that's TV mode, and then I would set the shutter speed to 1/2000th of a second. I would set the ISO down to auto, and I would let the camera choose the aperture. Then let's hit Q here, and we're gonna go up and we're gonna pick servo for continuous autofocus, and the drive mode should be set to high speed continuous. I know you don't understand all that yet, we'll get to it later. This is just an example of how to use custom mode. Now that I have those settings dialed in, I want to save them to memory so I can quickly recall them. After all, I might have to shoot my kid's soccer game right after I do some portraits. And if I screw up a setting, I could end up screwing up the entire shoot. So it helps reduce human error as well as saving you some time. So now that I've got those settings dialed in, I'm going to go into the menu. I'm going to go to the wrench menu, page 6. Here you'll see custom shooting mode. I'll pick that. I'll select register settings, and then I'll go to custom shooting mode C1. Then I'll select OK. Now all my current settings are saved under C1. Now let's say I do portrait shoots, and I do that in aperture priority mode. I do that with a low f-stop number and an automatic shutter speed. I've set that on the camera. Now I'll select the menu. I'll go to custom shooting mode, register settings. I'll set that to C2. So now I have to remember sports are C1, portraits are C2. Maybe I'll write that on a piece of paper on the back of my camera behind that screen. Now watch, when I change the mode dial to C1, you can see here it says C1 TV. That means it's in shutter priority. When I switch to C2, it says C2 AV. That means C2 is aperture priority mode. So I'm in C1 now, and you can see my shutter speed is 1/2000th. In C2, my shutter speed is 1/60th. It's the aperture that's being controlled. So now I have one mode for shooting my kid's soccer game, and then I can switch right into portraits when I want to take the pictures of the winning team afterward. That is such a useful mode that everybody should remember. Now let's talk about how to use eye autofocus. I told you earlier, you don't have to use the little thumbstick on the back to select your autofocus point, especially for portraits, wildlife, sports, anything. You should be relying on eye autofocus. Now press the Q mode, and the top option here, it says AF. Now I can select different autofocus modes here, either the whole area AF, which is the entire frame, or a specific point. But the more important thing, it says info, and you'll see right now a little circle with lines, and it says disable. If I push that, that is enabling subject tracking. That is the top option. The last option here is the subject to detect: people, animals, or cars. If you're focusing on a subject and you want the camera to automatically pick the focus point for you, that's where you select what they are. Now, I'll focus on myself, and I'm a people, so I'll select people. Now when I spin the camera around, you can see it's drawing a box on my eye. And when I half press the shutter, it's locked onto my eye. You can see if I move my head, it's picking the closest eye all the time. It is incredibly smart. Here, let's take a selfie. And you'll notice little left and right arrows pop up there. I can push the thumbstick to switch between the different eyes. So if it's focusing on the wrong eye or the wrong person, toggle between them by pushing the thumbstick. Just remember, when you go to take a picture of your dog or your bird, switch it to animals or vehicles or whatever. Now let's talk about manually focusing the camera. Let's grab this camera here from the background, and I'll put it here in the foreground and we can manually focus on it. On the front of the camera, I'm going to switch it to MF. And now by turning the dial on the front of the camera, I can control the focus. And you see the camera is showing to me the focus distance. If I want to focus as close as possible, I'd scroll all the way to the left there, and then I would physically move the camera closer to the dials until the subject came in focus. You can see this particular lens gets extremely close. Manually focusing is not especially accurate, and you won't always get super sharp pictures. One way to get really sharp pictures is to get as close as you can to the autofocus, and then push the little magnify button on the back of the camera, and then push info, and now you're zooming in. You can push info again to zoom in even further, and now you can really nail focus right on where you want the subject to be sharp. Then take your picture. Speaking of focusing modes, I want to tell you about back button focus, which is my preferred way to focus. It's kind of advanced. Don't feel like you have to do this on day one, but when you start to get more advanced, it's going to make life much easier. With back button focus, you decouple autofocus from the shutter button. Notice right now when I half press the shutter button, it always tries to autofocus. That is usually very useful, but there are times when you don't want to autofocus. For example, night photography. You might take great care to autofocus on a subject, but then you want to be able to recompose without the camera jumping onto something else. Macro photography is a time where you might want to autofocus once and then stop autofocusing. With back button autofocus, it is automatic. The camera does not refocus unless you specifically tell it to. What I do is I push the AF on button on the back, which always causes the camera to autofocus, and then I just take pictures. So I pretty much always have that button pushed in, but I always have the option of letting it up. If you don't yet understand, head to sdp.io/YBB, and I have a whole tutorial showing exactly why that's useful. I'm going to show you how to set it up on this camera. We're going to go into the menu system. We're going to go to the custom menus here. That's the icon with the camera and the lines below it. And then on page 3, you'll see customize buttons. I'm going to select this shutter button here. And by default, it says metering and autofocus start. That means when you half press a shutter, it starts to autofocus. I'm going to have it just meter. Select that. And that's all I have to do to set up back button focus. So now I'm half pressing the shutter, and you can see it is not trying to autofocus. It doesn't autofocus until I press the AF on button. I've shown you a small fraction of the overall menu system, and yet it's still really confusing. It's hard for me to remember where things are. I suggest you set up your own custom menu with the items that you use regularly. I'll show you how to do that. First, go into the menu system, and then go to the rightmost menu with a star there. This is my menu. By default, it has no tabs, so you need to set up a new tab by selecting the top item, add my menu tab. Select OK. Now you have a fresh tab. Now you want to add items to this menu. Select configure, and then select items to register. Now, maybe you want to adjust the image quality on a regular basis. Okay. Scroll through here, find some other item that you regularly change. I change raw burst mode on a regular basis, so I'll add that. And then I also change the interval timer, so I'll select that. Press the menu to back up here, and now you can see I have a menu with just the items that I regularly use. I can configure it here to resort, delete items, delete the entire tab, to rename the tab. Maybe this tab is all about image quality, so I'll name it quality. And you can see that name in the upper right corner there. The first time you have to go hunting for a menu item that you can't find, make a point of adding it to the My Menu tab so you can find it the next time. Let's talk about image stabilization. This camera has two types of stabilization depending on the lens you're using. It has sensor stabilization, so the sensor inside the camera actually moves around to cancel out camera shake. Some lenses will also have image stabilization, and they will work with the camera's sensor stabilization. This is generally fine. You might want to turn it off by going to camera 8. Here you can see IS mode is turned on. I always leave it on. You don't have to turn it off if you're going on a tripod or something, but I did want to show you where it was. You'll also see there's a separate setting for video, digital image stabilization. Video image stabilization improves the stability of video quality when you're hand holding the camera. So I'll show you what it looks like. Like you can kind of see the amount of camera shake that I have now when I'm looking at this camera. Let me turn the video stabilization to an on or enhanced. On crops in a little bit. So you can see this is a little bit tighter and it's a little bit more stable. If I go to image stabilization and turn digital IS to enhanced, you can see it's cropped in even tighter, but it's even more stable. Especially if I'm walking, this would cancel out much more motion than the standard stabilization would. However, it crops the video, so you get a narrower angle of view than you normally would. Standard IS for stills, leave it on all the time. For video, turn it on or off, depending on how much shaking of the camera that you're doing. If you ever want to make a time lapse where you just see like the sun rising or setting over a long period of time, I think they're so fun. There's two ways you can make time lapses, and the first is by taking a series of stills, say every 30 seconds or every 1 second, and then stitching them together later in post. I'll leave the stitching part to you, but for now I want to show you how to set it up on the camera. First, go into stills mode by setting the power button to on. Then go to camera, page 7, and select interval timer. We're going to set this to enable. With this set to enable, I'm going to press info to change the details of it. Now here you can see I can set the interval. Maybe I want it to be every 2 seconds. And the number of shots, which if you scroll down, you can just do an unlimited number of shots. I usually just set it to unlimited, and then when I'm done with the time lapse, I'll just turn it off. That's easier than trying to do the math. Then I'll select OK. And now I would put my camera on a tripod, and when I press the shutter, you can see it's blinking timer, and then it's automatically taking pictures on the timeline that I specified. And to stop it, I would turn it off. And after I turn it off, you can see the camera automatically disables the interval timer, so it will not automatically trigger again. You'd have to go back in and turn it on manually. Now, the interval timer, you take still photos and then stitch them together in post. There is another option, and that is a time-lapse movie, where it actually makes the video file for you. If you're a vlogger and you want to get just a quick recording of the sunrise, and you don't want to have to stitch it together because you're just trying to speed up your whole workflow, this is what you would do. First, move the camera into video mode. Go to camera page 5, select this, go to time-lapse and select enable. And now you can see I can adjust the interval here, the number of shots, the video size. Of course, you'd want to do 4K. With time-lapses, it's really helpful to be able to crop. Then you can adjust the actual auto exposure, whether you want the exposure adjusted for each frame or fixed. Usually you want it fixed. If the exposure changes with each frame, then you could get flickering in it. Do you want the screen to turn off and save yourself a little bit of battery? You might want to. And do you want it to beep with every picture? Of course you don't want it to beep. And now when you're ready, just press the record button, and you see it prompts you to start with the shutter button. Then I push the shutter, and you can see I set it to take a picture every 1 second, and so it is going to make a little time lapse for me, and I can stop it with the shutter button. Now typically there's 30 frames per second, so it's going to have to take 30 of those pictures to make a full second of video, so you're going to have to be taking a lot of stills. Just factor that into your intervals. Now I want to show you how to configure your file formats. This is JPEG versus RAW versus HEIC. I'm not going to go into full explanation. You can watch this video at stp.io/rawvjpeg. Switching back to stills mode, I'll go into the camera. Page 1 here, it's the very first menu item. That's how important it is. So I'll select image quality. You can see by default it's set to just large JPEG. RAW is turned off. I can move the front dial here to select RAW or touch it, or CRAW. CRAW is Canon RAW. It makes the files a little bit smaller without really having a degradation in image quality. I do prefer to use CRAW. Now I could turn JPEG off completely by scrolling left and right. For me, I do all my image processing in Lightroom or Lightroom Classic, and that does great jobs with RAW. So I pretty much always shoot RAW, unless on the R7, if I'm shooting action and I don't want to run up against buffering problems, then I will shoot JPEG. That allows me to shoot just really rapidly.
Here's Chelsea to demonstrate exactly what I mean.
You might want to use JPEG if you want to maintain your high frame rate for a longer period of time. Because RAW files are larger, your camera will have a more difficult time processing them, and so you'll start buffering sooner. Let me show you what I mean. So you can hear it interrupting. Let's put it into JPEG mode and see what it sounds like. It's not stopping. Oh. So a little bit longer if you need to track action for a very long time, consider using JPEG.
Now, you might be familiar with HEF or HEIC files from using your iPhone. It's standard on a lot of smartphones. These are a much more modern, highly compressed image format that's just about as compatible as JPEG. So they take up less space, but they also have higher quality because they have 10 bits of color instead of 8 bits. And you don't have to understand that, but do understand it's better quality. If you want to select the HEIC files, it's in a weird place. Go to camera page 2 and go down to HDR shooting HDR PQ, and then select enabled. And you can see here, shots are captured as HEF or RAW files. Now I'll go back to the left, and if I select the image quality again, you can see now it says JPEG/HEF. So now when I take pictures, they'll be recorded in that newer, more modern format. Now you might have seen menu items in here saying HDR mode. HDR is high dynamic range. That allows you to capture more detail in the shadows and the highlights, and that's something you really want, especially when on a really sunny day with the sun behind your subject. But the in-camera HDR is bad. I'll show you how to get to it. It's on camera page 2. You can see HDR mode here. You can adjust these settings, but you should not. If you want HDR, what you should do instead is go to camera page 2, this top setting here, Expo Comp/AEB. I'm sorry it's named that. AEB stands for auto exposure bracketing. And bracketing is varying the exposure of multiple different shots so that one is properly exposed, one is overexposed, and one is underexposed. So let's select that. And you can see here I have 2 adjustments. The top one is the exposure compensation, so I can make my picture brighter or darker. I'll leave that at 0. And then I'm going to use the main dial here to adjust the exposure bracketing. I'm going to move this all the way out, and then I'm going to press set OK. Let's take a picture of my camera here. I'm going to take 3 pictures. And you can see as I review them, the first picture is properly exposed, the second picture is underexposed, and the third picture is overexposed. In Lightroom or Lightroom Classic, I can combine those 3 pictures to produce a picture with much higher image quality than I could otherwise. And now you're saying, how am I supposed to know how to use Lightroom or Lightroom Classic or what the differences are? Don't worry, I happen to have written entire books on the subject. This is a brand new Lightroom book, which is the same software you use on your phone or computer. Then of course we have Lightroom Classic and our Photoshop book. These are all available at Northrup.photo. I suggest getting the Book Lovers or Everything bundle where you get all of these together. They each include not just a book or an ebook, but training, videos, practices, sample files you can work with, and you're helping to support a small business and a guy who made this big old video tutorial for you for absolutely free. If you need to get Lightroom, you can head to this link here, sdp.io/Adobe deal to sign up for a trial. When I need to transfer files from my camera to a computer or a phone, I pretty much always just end up taking out the memory card and then putting it into a memory card reader and then connecting it to my computer or to my phone. Here are some memory card readers you can use for an iPhone or for an Android phone with USB-C or USB-A. Canon also includes a Wi-Fi app that you can use to transfer files and remotely control your camera. This app is one of the worst apps in the App Store. If you don't believe me, just check the reviews. But let's check it out. I'll show you how to set it up, and you can decide for yourself whether you want to use it. First, I'm going to open up my App Store. I'm using an iPhone, and I'm going to search for Canon Camera to Connect. When I open it, I'm going to allow it to access my photos. I'm going to allow it to connect to Bluetooth, find devices on the local network. I'm going to take note of that warning. And now I'll select their easy connection guide. You can see I've used this on a few cameras already, but I'll connect to this new camera here. I'm going to type R7, select OK. Yes, I have an R7. Here, I'll take the recommendation and connect via Bluetooth first. And it's going to give me instructions for how to connect to the camera. I'll follow the instructions by opening up the menu. Then it wants me to go to the thing that looks like a radio tower. I'll select Wi-Fi Bluetooth connection. Then I'll select connect to smartphone. Now the camera's telling me to change Wi-Fi to enable. I'll select add a device to connect to. I'll select iOS, that's iPhone, and now it's showing me a QR code. So if I didn't already have the app up, I could scan that with my camera to open it up in the App Store. So now I'm going to select pair via Bluetooth. Now my phone has found it, so I'll select that. I'll choose to pair. Then I have to confirm that on the camera, and now they're connecting. Great, so now they're connected. I'll select images on the camera, and now it's going to use that Bluetooth connection to actually connect via Wi-Fi for faster transfers. You can see my phone is prompting me to switch Wi-Fi networks from my home here to the camera's Wi-Fi network. It acts as its own access point. And now the connection is established, so I can actually go in and select pictures to transfer. Maybe I like those 3 pictures. I can now select import at the bottom of the screen, and it's going to copy them over. So I had to do that 3 times before I got it to work once, and that's probably why the app has 2.5 stars. It is a little flaky, but just simply trying it again and again and starting the camera did eventually get it to work. But at the same time, if I'm on vacation and I'm trying to transfer some pictures real quick, that's a frustrating experience. I don't want to be having not fun on vacation, right? That's why I tend to just rely on a memory card reader, because that works 100% of the time. So now you can see I can open up the photo app, and there they are in my Photos app, just like any other picture that I took. I also have the option of remote live view shooting here. Now that it's connected, once again, it has to establish a Wi-Fi connection, because after I transferred those pictures, it dropped that Wi-Fi connection. So I'm restarting it, and it's going to take a few seconds, and this time it won't let me join. Turn the camera off, try this again, unable to join. Now I want to show you how to use Image.canon, which connects your camera directly to Canon's cloud network to upload your pictures. It's a great way to offload your pictures sort of in real time, as long as you have Wi-Fi access from your camera. The Wi-Fi transfers are much slower than you'll get with your phone. And of course, it's not a cellular connection, so you have to be home, though you could tether it to an access point on your phone if you want to transfer pictures to Image.canon on the go. Let's go into the menu system and we can start setting it up. Once again, on the Wi-Fi menu, I'm going to go to the first menu item, Wi-Fi Bluetooth connection. Then I'll go to the cloud, Image.canon. Now it tells me I want to install the Image.canon app on my phone. Now notice Image.canon has 1.8 stars. It's actually worse rated than the Canon app that I was just struggling with, but let's open it up and we can see how it works. You can create an account here or sign in. I happen to already have an account. I'm logged in, and now on the camera, I will select connect. I finished the user registration, so I can click OK here. And now I'm going to connect the app to the camera. So from the app here, I'm going to hit the menu in the upper left corner, and then under connected camera, I will select new. I'll select the camera model, R7, and then at the bottom, I'll select read QR code. Give it access to the camera. I will read the QR code. Now I need to connect the camera to my home's Wi-Fi access point. My home network is called TC Home. It's actually showing 2 of them. Sometimes I've seen like 10 of them. That's because each individual channel looks different to the camera. It's not sophisticated like your iPhone. It's actually very primitive. So I'll just pick this first one here. Then I have to enter the password, select OK. Of course, auto IP address setting is fine. You can use TCP/IPv6, that's fine. I see both the camera and the app are confirming it, so I'll select OK on both. And now the camera is warning me to send the images automatically. I have to turn the camera off and then back on again. This happens without my phone. I don't need to have my phone on me. This is entirely the camera connecting directly to the internet. It's a pretty cool feature when it does work. You can see these are the settings for Image.canon. I have auto send set to enable. I can choose to send just stills or stills and video. You might want to do just stills because videos are so big that they will take a long time to send. Still, if you're patient, they will eventually send. And then if you want to change your Wi-Fi network, you can do switch network here. For this to work, it said I have to turn the camera off and then back on again. So I'll do that. I'll take a selfie. Now, after turning the camera off and on, you can see it's transmitting pictures. And if I refresh, there are my selfies. If I want to get at my Photos app, I can select Action and then Download. That looked easier than it was. I could not get that to work, and I finally gave up and shut the camera off, and then about half an hour later, after turning it off and on several times, it suddenly connected and started sending the pictures. So if I were on vacation, I would now be having a much less fun time. I would just be frustrated, which is why I just resort to transferring pictures with a memory card. It does work sometimes, does not work all the times, but I guarantee you, at some point, it's going to frustrate you. Now I'm going to show you how to set the copyright name on your pictures. The picture's automatically copyrighted, but setting the copyright can be a useful way to identify your camera in case it's lost or stolen or something. So go into the menus, go to the wrench and go to page 6, and then go down to copyright information. enter author's name, and now you can put your name in here. And now your name will be added to the metadata of each picture that you take. Now I'm going to show you how to use raw burst mode, which is incredibly useful for sports photography. With raw burst mode, when you press the shutter, it captures up to 30 frames. Raw files, always raw files, using the electronic shutter. We'll talk more about electronic shutters and such in a bit, but for now, to turn on raw burst mode, hit the menu, go to the camera tab, and go to page 6. For raw burst mode, select that, and then select enable. The only real reason I'd ever want to use raw burst mode is when I'm also using pre-shooting. So I always turn both of these on together. Raw burst mode takes pictures in a really rapid sequence. I'm going to move my camera here up and down, and then I'm going to push the shutter to activate a raw burst of 30 frames. Notice the shutter did not make any sound when I was taking those pictures. That's because the camera automatically switched to the silent electronic shutter. Now to access these files, it's a little different. I'll hit the play button like I usually do. And you can see instead of showing me a single picture, it shows the raw burst icon. So if I select that, what I can do is to play each of the different raw files. And you can see as I move it up and down, I can see every different frame that it took. 79 frames, in fact. Now I don't want to process 79 frames. And in fact, you cannot simply import that into Lightroom or any other image processor other than Canon's own desktop software, which is bad. It's very bad. So when I find the frame I like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the set button here. And then I can extract this as a JPEG, a RAW, or a HEF file. So RAW is probably what I want to do. And I save that as a new file. And so let's view the extracted RAW image. And now you can see here is the picture, like a standalone picture, that I now could import into Lightroom Classic, provided I extract it on the camera. That's definitely the right way to do these things. Now the cool thing about raw burst is it will take pictures back in time. It will take pictures up to a half a second before you push the shutter. We enabled that when we enabled the pre-shooting. You can see from the description, you have to half press the shutter half a second before you're going to take the picture. And then when you fully press, it goes back in time and records everything that it had captured from the time you half pressed the shutter. This is useful because imagine your kid is swinging the bat in a baseball game. And you don't want to take a bunch of pictures of them missing the ball, right? You only want the picture of them hitting the ball. Your kid's about to swing. Half press the shutter. Now it's buffering those pictures, but it's not recording them. The kid swings and they miss. Don't push the shutter all the way. Next time they're at bat, they're getting ready, half press the shutter so it's recording. They swing and they hit. And as soon as you hear that ball hit, now you push the shutter all the way and it goes back in time and saves those images. This way, you don't have to sort through a bunch of pictures that you don't end up using. Of course, after you capture those, you'll want to go back and extract the perfect picture, the one where the ball hits the bat. Before you actually shoot your kid's game, know that raw burst mode and electronic shutter have some serious drawbacks that I'll talk about in just 1 second, so hang on for that. I want to show you the auto level. This is so cool. The camera will actually automatically level the shot for you because I'm always like tilted off a couple of degrees, and you can fix that in post by rotating and cropping, but then you end up losing some of the data, right? It's better to get it in camera. So let's see how to turn that on. I'm going to go into the menu and I'm going to go to camera 8 and you'll see auto level here. Now it's camera 8 when you're shooting stills. It's different for video. So I will enable it. Now watch as I rotate the camera, it slowly levels itself back out until I have a level picture again. So that doesn't mean every picture you take is going to be level, but if you give it half a second when you're getting ready to take a picture, then it actually will be level. And that's so useful, but it comes with some serious caveats that the camera explains to you when it turns it on. You can see it says it disables electronic first curtain shutter, and it also disables high-speed continuous shooting modes. So you could shoot low-speed continuous, like that, but I can no longer do like 15 or 30 frames per second. In the shutter mode, I can pick mechanical or electronic, but I cannot pick electronic first curtain shutter. Electronic first curtain shutter is what you would normally want to use. So you have to go in and turn this setting off anytime you're shooting sports, and then you'd want to turn it back on when you were doing travel or landscape photography so stuff could be level. That is easy to forget, but that's a good use for those custom shooting modes that I showed you earlier. Now, if you want auto level on in video, let's switch the camera to video mode. Auto level is no longer on camera page 8, it's on camera page 6. And if I turn it on for video, well, it's not that great. Like, watch. You see, it has that little bit of lag which it's weird, right? Like if you're hand holding a shot where it might be a little bit off level, it's gonna look a little bit weird as the camera is constantly adjusting a good half second after you go off level. However, if you're shooting video and you're setting it up on a tripod and you might be a little bit off level, that auto level mode can actually straighten out your shot for you and is useful. Now let's talk about the different types of shutter modes. The shutter is what actually takes your picture. It's that thing that makes a click sound sometimes, but there are many situations where you wouldn't want it to make a click sound. Like maybe you're shooting a wedding and the couple is saying their vows and you don't want to be the photographer that's like click, 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 click. Or sometimes golf games do not allow a noisy shutter. You'd want to use silent shutter. It's good for birds where the shutter might give away your location and disturb them. These are all times when I like to use the silent shutter. To turn that on, go to camera page 7 and down in silent shutter function, turn that on. And you can see right below it, it changed the shutter mode to electronic. And now when I take pictures, well, there's no sound, but you do see the blinking lines along the side of the screen. That's indicating that you're taking pictures. It is really easy to take a whole lot of pictures in silent shutter mode since you're not getting that audible feedback and you might end up with a lot to sort through. Now, there are a lot of differences between the mechanical shutter, which always makes noise, and the electronic shutter, which can be silent. To get the most out of this camera, it's very important that you understand these. The electronic shutter shoots at 30 frames per second maximum, while the mechanical shutter is limited to 15 frames per second. So that's a big win for the electronic shutter for anybody shooting sports. The electronic shutter is silent. The mechanical shutter always makes noise. Now, silent is usually better, street photography, whatever, but portraits, it's really actually pretty important for the shutter to make noise so that the person who's posing knows you've taken a picture, because what's more awkward than like standing there smiling and somebody's using a silent shutter and you don't know when to stop or when to change your pose. So I actually turn on the noisy shutter for those situations. Electronic shutter has a massive, massive disadvantage, and that is rolling shutter. Mechanical shutter does not have a rolling shutter. The rolling shutter is caused by the amount of time it takes the sensor to read from the top of the frame to the bottom of the frame. Even if your shutter speed is 1/8,000th of a second, it takes about like 1/40th of a second or so for it to do that entire readout. Thus, if you're panning the camera, you might see that things that are straight will end up bendy. The subject's position in the frame has moved while the camera was panning. Here's a panning shot with just the field goal from a football field, and you can see the mechanical shutter on the left is nice and straight. The electronic shutter is all bendy. By the way, this is figure 9.2 from my book, Stunning Digital Photography. So if you do want to understand all the camera settings and stuff, you'd already know the stuff if you read Stunning Digital Photography. The rolling shutter with the electronic shutter has picture ruining implications for sports and wildlife. Here's an actual picture of a great blue heron that my wife took using the R7, and you can see because she was panning with the flying bird, the background is all bendy and this picture is completely ruined. I only use the mechanical shutter for sports and wildlife on this camera. And as you remember, that means that I have to drop down to 15 frames per second. That's kind of a bummer, but 15 frames per second is still really, really fast. You'd want to use the electronic shutter when you are shooting fast action for 30 frames per second, but don't be tempted by that because your best pictures are going to be ruined by the rolling shutter effect. Here's an example of Chelsea swinging a wiffle ball bat. Nowhere near as fast as a professional athlete would be, but you can see that wiffle ball bat turns into a bendy banana and her arm looks all messed up. Electronic shutter ruined that picture, and it will ruin your action pictures too, but it is okay for mostly still subjects, things like portraits. A perched bird, electronic shutter is great. A flying bird, you want to go back to the mechanical shutter. The electronic shutter's slow readout speed will also cause banding under artificial lights with high shutter speeds. So if you're shooting faster than say 1/125th of a second, maybe 1/250th of a second, under artificial lights, especially LED lights, which actually flicker on and off faster than you can see, then you're going to see banding like this. The slower your shutter speed, the more subtle it's going to be. But if you're shooting action like indoor sports at a basketball game and you're at 1/2000th of a second, not only are you going to get rolling shutter, but you're going to get banding like that too. Again, no problem. Just switch back to the mechanical shutter. Now I want to show you some tricks about reviewing pictures. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Press the playback button to review photos, and there's my smiling face. I'll hit the set button here to bring up a menu. And you can see on the left side here, I can scroll between some useful functions. The one I like the most is the rating button. This allows me to assign 1 to 5 stars. I'll set this as 5 stars. Now when I import those pictures into Lightroom or Lightroom Classic, that one will be marked as 5 stars. I can instantly sort it and find it amongst the thousands of pictures that I might have taken during a photo shoot or on vacation. This is such a useful workflow feature because maybe you're a sports photographer and you have 10 minutes while somebody takes a timeout or between innings. You can go through and find the best pictures, set them with a rating, and then when you go to import them, you don't have to go through everything. In other words, you can do culling in the field by rating your pictures, and it saves the amount of time that you're spending at the computer sorting through your photos. I also like to delete photos that did not turn out, so I don't have to import them. That's easy, just pull up a picture and then press the delete button. When you go to delete a photo, it says cancel by default, and you have to scroll to the right to select erase. And if you want to delete 20 photos, that could take a little bit of time. I find it easier to set erase to the default. They made a menu item just for me and you. Go to custom settings here, page 4, and you can see default erase option. Select erase selected. And now it'll just save you one key press every time you go to erase a photo. By default, when you take pictures, the camera is going to show those to you. That's useful if you're taking just one picture and you don't mind chimping, but for me, so much of the time, I don't want to be distracted by reviewing my photos. I just want to spend my time shooting, so I turn off the auto review feature. To do that, hit the menu button, go over to the camera menu, page 8, go down to image review, select it, in review duration, set this to off. If you like reviewing your photos and you might want to use the viewfinder to review photos, you can set viewfinder display to enable, but I don't ever want to review my photos unless I manually choose to. Canon has provided a few options for the display performance that can make the display look a little bit better, be a little bit faster, but burn through your batteries a little quicker. I'll let you decide how you want to weigh that compromise, but open up the menus, go to page 9. Under display performance, you can choose between power saving and smooth. Smooth looks a little bit better. It's just a little smoother, but you might never notice. If you're a hybrid shooter switching between stills and video, there's kind of a confusing thing I wanted to tell you about. Menu settings will be in different menus. We've talked about it a couple of times, but sometimes a camera setting will be on page 1 when you're shooting stills or page 3 when you're shooting video. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Now let's switch to the video mode here. We'll look at the actual video settings to talk about the resolution, the frame rate, and such. Now, when you're in stills, this is on a different page. So make sure if you're following along that you have the on switch set to video. On page 1 here, you can see movie rec size. This controls the resolution and frame rate of your video. And these settings can actually be pretty confusing. The default settings are very low quality, full HD and 30 frames per second. I like 4K and I like 60 frames per second, so that's how I would set it up. The third option here, IPB or light IPB. Light IPB just makes a smaller, more compressed file. And in my opinion, the image quality is just fine, and I'd rather save myself some space and increase my total recording time, which is shown in the upper right corner there. Now, some of these options are confusing, like why are there 4 different 4K options? 4K crop crops in 1.5 times. That's good for far away subjects, and in fact the video quality can be a little bit better. I use 4K crop when I'm doing wildlife photography because you never really get close enough to birds, so I crop in. I'll still get that great 4K quality. I can still do 60 frames per second, but I don't have to crop in post, so everything ends up being a little bit sharper. 4K here always reads from the full width, even when you're shooting at 60 frames per second. But it does what's called line skipping, where it's not reading every one of the lines on the 30 megapixel sensor, and thus the actual quality is a little bit lower than it is on 4K fine.
Look at this example and freeze here, enhance. You can see the fine shows the detail in these flowers, which are lost in the standard 4K. But as a penalty, the 4K fine overheats faster. Still, it recorded for a solid 47 minutes indoors in air conditioning.
So I want to select 4K fine here, but it says these items cannot be combined because you can't do 60 frames per second in 4K fine. So I'll drop down to 30 frames per second 4K fine. You can also use this camera to shoot slow motion, which Canon calls high frame rate. So once again, on the same menu here, we're going to set high frame rate to on. And you can see now it's telling me it's going to do 1920 by 1080, that's full HD, at 120 frames per second. But note that caveat, audio is not recorded. So it's not going to record sound for your slow motion videos, which is a real bummer. That means you might want to get an actual recorder and then sync it up to the video in post, which is actually going to be pretty hard to do since you don't have any sound to do the automatic syncing. Save that 120 frames per second for times when you really do need it. If you are recording video, you should manually adjust the audio levels because the default setting will probably sound really bad. Down here at sound recording, select this, and you can see it's set to auto. Auto sound recording does not work well. When I'm talking, there's little gaps between my words, and the camera will hear that moment of silence and crank the volume up. So you suddenly will hear like ambient noise, like whoosh up in every bit of silence and then go back down whenever somebody talks. It just sounds like garbage. So select sound recording and then set it to manual. Then hit recording level, and you can see the levels here. And I'm getting some peaks, so I'm a little too loud. It's better to be too low than too loud because you can always crank up the volume in post. So to me, I like to have it just peeking into the yellows like that. That gives me plenty of room, and if somebody decides to shout later, I'll know I have coverage. This concludes the hands-on tutorial part of this. Now I want to talk to you about what lenses you should get, what flashes you should get, a tripod-like accessories to make your photography better. Whew, am I tired. First, I want to plug my store, Northrup.photo. Head there now to get the award-winning, stunning digital photography. Check out video training series like the Art and Science of Photography. Check out our professional portrait training, our flash training guide, and of course, books on Lightroom and Photoshop. Of course, when you buy from Northrup.photo, you're helping to support a family business. It's just me and Chelsea.
Why shop Amazon Prime when you can support small businesses? This is where our good little friend Tony walks every morning. He looks at his pictures that he's working on, and then he sends you your thing. So this is our brand new Lightroom book.
You can go to Amazon and check the reviews, but I'd rather you actually order them from our own personal store. Of course, we ship worldwide if you want the paperbacks, but you can also just get the ebooks. Heck, you can just buy the books and just watch the videos. A lot of people do that. Now let's talk about lens suggestions for your Canon R7. If you happen to get the 18 to 55 kit lens, I would strongly recommend upgrading to the 18 to 150 kit lens. That's what I have here. The thing is, 18 to 150 is a much broader range of photography. This allows you to do some sports photography, far away things. And that is a big advantage over your smartphone camera. And that's the key reason you probably bought this, right? You probably want better pictures. If you use our scp.io link, that's our affiliate link. That means we get a little bit of support. The first lens I would recommend you getting is the RF 50mm f1.8, which is only about $180. What a great deal. On your RF camera here, it ends up being a fantastic portrait lens, where it's about like 85mm f2.8 or so, and it will allow you to get just beautiful background blur, actual real bokeh that you really can't easily produce with the kit lens. If you're shooting sports, hold on to your wallet. You really want a fast lens that allows you to freeze motion while still giving you good image quality. People, especially shooting indoor sports with this, will complain, oh, there's so much noise in my pictures. Why is everything so grainy, so speckly? It's because your kit lens is pretty slow. It has an f-stop of f6.3. This 70-200 f2.8 lens gathers about 6 times more light than this does. It's much bigger, heavier, and definitely more expensive at $2,800, but the image quality will be drastically better. So if you are a serious sports photographer, give that lens a consideration. And if you want to get into wildlife photography, Canon has a budget lens here, $800. That's still a lot. But for a wildlife photography and the results you get, it's absolutely amazing. This is my favorite budget recommendation. It works fantastic with the R7, the Canon 800mm f11 at $900. If you have a few more bucks, a more versatile wildlife lens is Canon's 100 to 500. That's what me and Chelsea use when we're out on the kayak with this R7. Especially, it works fantastic, but it's $2,900. It's expensive. In addition to all those RF mirrorless lenses, you can also use Canon DSLR lenses, which is especially useful if you are upgrading from a Canon DSLR. You just need the EF to RF adapter, which is about $100. Put that on your camera, then put your DSLR lens onto the adapter, and everything will work pretty good. Now let's talk about flash suggestions. Real quickly, I recommend the Godox V862C with the wireless trigger. This only costs about $240. It is so much cheaper than the wildly overpriced Canon flashes that you'll have a bunch of money left over to support a small business and get some photography education, which will make a way bigger difference in your photography than just buying gear well. This flash opened up so many possibilities especially for portraits, but for things like real estate photography and even sports too. Lighting makes a big difference. Be sure to check out our flash buying guide at Northrup.photo. Justin and I are total pros, and we still use the same $240 flash. It's awesome. In the studio, we use Godox also known as Flashpoint in the United States, but we like the XPlor 600 Pro wireless. Check it out at this link here. The great thing about these studio strobes is that they're battery powered. So we will take it out to the park for a location photo shoot, and it works just the same as it does in our studio. They're absolutely wonderful. And they are expensive, but they're so much less expensive than all the competition. Now let's talk about tripods, which support your camera, and something everybody needs, whether you're filming video and you don't want it to be shaky, or you want to get into astrophotography, night photography. I recommend the Manfrotto Be-Free series of tripods that you can pick up at this link. Pick the one that suits your purpose. They have video tripods, still tripods with ball heads. They have big tripods and small tripods, carbon fiber tripods that are a little bit lighter. Whichever one you get, I've been happy with the entire series. And in fact, that's what I'm filming this on right now. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to see our free tutorials and reviews and photo news. Also, bookmark this link and come back to it, because this was a lot of information. There's no way you took all this in one viewing, so go back and watch it again. And remember to work along with your camera. If you have follow-up tips, I'd love to hear how you use the R7. Write a comment down below. Of course, if you have a question, ask in the comments and maybe I'll see it. Thanks, bye.